Is the trade market just not there for Zach LaVine yet again? And the question the Chicago Bulls should be asking themselves, what is the next step if they're unable to move Zach LaVine, which was one of the reported targets coming into the season? We're talking about all the options there, plus why we're about to see a lot more of Lonzo Ball and Matas Buzelis. All that and more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. I'm the host here, Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that said, let's go ahead and get into this content for today, y'all. And so according to Brian Windhorst, the Bulls are going to have some trouble yet again moving on from Zach LaVine if there's their reported goal. Windhorst saying this in the latest episode of the Hoop Collective said this: "We know that he's been on the trade block for a year now, and at least. Yet I hear nothing about LaVine on the trade market, and I don't think it's because the Bulls aren't interested in trading him." So meaning that the Bulls are having just difficulty finding a trade partner for Zach LaVine, and I don't think that should be too surprising. Yes, Zach LaVine's season has been really good. And I know as fans, we look at players and we think, hey, this should up the trade market. But I think that 25 games roughly of what the Chicago Bulls played doesn't really change years worth of concerns around Zach LaVine for many GMs around the league. Now, I do want to be clear here. If Zach LaVine keeps playing well and teams are struggling or teams are missing a player, it could get them back in and be willing to take. I'm not saying that his play isn't necessarily going to help the chances here. But when you pair this as well that we heard last week that teams around the league or execs around the league are saying that the Bulls' asking price is still what they feel is a little bit too high for Zach LaVine, it just gets back to that place that, all right, well, between what the Bulls' asking price is, between still some of the concerns, and Zach LaVine's only played 22 games this season, besides those, around those concerns, hey, we're still wondering, is the contract worth? I think that's really what it comes down to with Zach LaVine. We've seen players with worse numbers than Zach LaVine get moved. Now, they don't always have the contract that Zach LaVine has. Now, we've also seen players with contracts right around or not even larger than Zach LaVine. Zach LaVine's get moved multiple times. So it really comes down to like where that overlap is, right? He's already missed some time this season because of, injury. So, maybe that could have reinvigorated just some concern there, things like that. But, overall, the Bulls, okay, if they're having trouble moving Zach LaVine, they're having trouble moving Zach LaVine. And this team still has other things and other business they needed to get to, and that's what we're going to get into next. But I'm not too shocked by hearing it. I've seen some reactions like, oh, their teams are shocked. And you got to keep in mind, too, like one thing that I think we've seen pretty consistently as well, at least in my opinion, is that teams try to get over on the Chicago Bulls mainly because the Bulls have allowed it for years and they tend to sell low. So I'm sure there's probably some waiting out as well, especially if the Bulls' asking price is higher. There's some waiting out for some other teams saying, hey, we wonder if they're going to become desperate to move off the Zach LaVine thing. Like, how much do the Bulls really want to keep their top 10 pick, and are they willing to get a little desperate if that's the case? And, that could clear up closer that we get to the trade deadline, right? So the Bulls right now do sit at the 10th seed in the Eastern Conference. They have a pace to win about 32.5 games, so they take that for what you will. The point differential is negative 3.9. That's typically around a 35-win-ish team, right? Before they were playing with the win pace of like a 30-win team. So, things have, with the Eastern Conference, one hot week can take you from out the play-in to in the play. Hell, can take you from out the play-in to the damn 6th seed, depending on how hot of a week and how many games you play, right? So, there's still that filling out period. And I think if the Bulls clearly are bad between now and like mid-January, and teams are like, well, the Bulls' asking price probably isn't going to go down any because they're still on pace to have a good chance to keep their top 10 pick. Maybe that changes some things around there also. But overall, I mean, we've heard players have low trade value before and it rise. We've heard, it before and it stays the same or maybe even gets worse. But I do think that contract to Zach LaVine is still there. $45 million during 2025-26. It goes up to almost $50 million the following season in 2026-27. So teams are going to have to really kind of do some forward thinking when it comes to moving forward a player like Zach LaVine. And that's where you have some questions and some doubts at. So we'll see what the future ends up holding. But here's the thing that I want to get into, because we know if the Bulls do move on from Zach LaVine, it's to keep that top 10 pick. What if the Bulls can't move Zach LaVine? What does that mean for the rest of the season for the Bulls? And here's the thing that I look at is that I've said it before. The Bulls actually have a good chance. I'm not saying a great chance, but they do have a chance to still keep their top 10 pick, even if they don't move on from Zach LaVine. And I don't think it's necessarily the worst case scenario. You look at how Zach LaVine's playing this year. He's engaged. He's on both sides of the ball. He's also at times deferring. He's only taken over 20 shots, I think, a couple of times this season. So he's really is playing a team brand of basketball. And if Zach LaVine's going to play this way, then, even if the Bulls do go a younger part where the roster can actually help. So I get it. I know a lot of people are off the Zach LaVine trade, or some of that's moving towards Kobe White now from some Bulls fans. And, I understand that, but I don't think it's the worst case. I don't think that it comes down to if we can't move Zach, it means that we can't keep our pick. I don't think that we're there yet with some other things that the Bulls still can do. And I know where the Bulls are winning right now. Having a $45 million player for a team that's on pace to win 32 games is concerning. You should be concerned about that. But we knew that coming into the season, development was probably going to be the focus. I think that continues for this team overall. And then the next question becomes, should the Bulls still look to move Vooch if they can't find a trade for Zach LaVine? Now, I've been on this train as far as since the start of the season that moving Zach and moving Vooch aren't mutually exclusive. They sit in two very different scenarios. Vooch is an expiring contract next year. And while the Bulls are looking or reportedly desiring to move off from LaVine because of the money, Vooch is not really the money. Vooch is actually paid relatively well, right? It's a reasonably priced contract. And so I think that with Vooch expiring, him being older, the Bulls, wanting to maximize keeping that top 10 pick, if that is their goal, that if you move Vooch without moving LaVine, it also solidifies your chances to keep your top 10 pick. So I do think that moving Vooch alone could, we're already on pace to win 32 games. Vooch has been one of our most consistent players. And so if you move off of that, that also gives you a higher chance to keep that top 10 pick. And so I do think the Bulls, if that's their goal, should still look to move on from Vooch. Now, there's a different goal to be said that if the Bulls do start winning, they're competing for a play-in spot, maybe you keep both of them. And I know there's going to be some fans that want to ride over me just saying that. Hold on. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best case scenario. I'm just saying I'm talking about the possibilities here. And that is a possibility as well. But I do think if they came into the season and the goal was to move off some stuff, then it stays the same. Moving Nikola Vucevic is not mutually exclusive to your ability to move Zach LaVine, in my opinion. And so, if you can get some value out of moving Vooch, and I would like to think that value is at least a low first round pick at the minimum, right? I know that, we had that report earlier that right now the value seems to be about 2 second round picks, but that's my hope. But at the end of the day, if you can find value, whatever the Bulls front office views as value, we may not see that same value as we've seen with this team for a long time, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that because that's what the front office values, that it actually is going to be value that the fans look at and say, yeah, you did a good one there. So I think that all plays a part into all this as well. So we'll see how it shakes out. We'll see how it goes down. And I think ultimately it just comes down to this. The Bulls have to really evaluate where they are, where their future lies, where all those things are going before they make a decision. And in whatever happens without moving Zach LaVine, there's still some goals in moving some of these other players on this roster, and that gets us to our next topic. The Vooch aspect of it is the Vooch aspect of it. I do think that with how Vooch is playing and expiring, how many bigs or how many teams could be looking for bigs around the trade deadline, you can get something back for Nikola Vucevic. What that is, we'll see. But I do think that the goal for the rest of the season of the Bulls is still development and moving off some veteran contracts. We've talked about LaVine, we've talked about Vooch. You still got Torrey Craig there, who I've talked about before, at him being at a vet minimum and a player that has played better with stars in his career, there could be some value there. Now, I'm not saying a first-round pick or anything, but you could get a second to a couple of, which is weird because we got offered 2 second-round picks for Drummond. To say that, earlier, that the value for Vooch is 2 second-round picks, what? But anyway, if you could get back some seconds for Torrey Craig, Javon Carter's still a player that could be moved, and then you still have salary cap filler and other deals that you can look to move. Chris Duarte is a salary cap filler like he was in the Bulls trade, right? With the sign and trade for the Sacramento Kings. So the Bulls still have those goals here, I think, right? And so you move off of some of your veterans, you clear out some of that money, right? And then you take advantage of some expirings a la Torrey Craig. and then you try to see what you can get going forward and just really stacking assets where it makes sense. And I think that regardless, like some of those moves are good for the Bulls regardless, right? Like moving Torrey Craig, considering he's completely out of the rotation, the rise of Matas Buzelis, that just makes sense for this team, regardless of whatever you do, whether you're trying to compete at the end of the season or you're trying to keep your top 10 pick, that makes sense. If you can include Jevon Carter and his $6.5 million deal next season, this season, and $6.8 million with a player option, Bulls got to stop giving out player options, yo. We really got to stop giving out those player options. Jevon Carter got a player option? What in the world? What did Jevon Carter come to with the table to be like, let me have the decision in the last? Why don't the Bulls ever do team options to where they have the power? Anyway, you got Jevon Carter there. You got Chris Duarte, who's a $5.8 million contract. So the Bulls have filler, and they have things and pieces that they can move either in larger deals or in several smaller deals as well to kind of make some things work. So that's where the Bulls sit right now. But that Torrey Craig contract is a very valuable one. $2.8 million for a defender, a wing defender, and a player that can help stretch the floor for you at times. Like I said, plays better when he's playing with stars. You add in Jevon Carter, Chris Duarte. That's roughly about $15 million in easily movable contracts, depending on the deal that the Bulls have at their disposal. So, depending on like if it is a larger deal where you need some salary cap filler, or it's a smaller deal to get some seconds back or anything like that to kind of just add to your stash there, the Bulls have those type of contracts. And then, of course, you got to talk about it because not that I necessarily am in this camp, but then, of course, you got the people that say, look to move on from Coby White and his $12.2 million deal this year and $12.8 million deal. So the Bulls have some things at their disposal to where this could still be an interesting trade deadline for the Bulls. It just depends on, have they finally picked a direction that they're going to stick to? That's the question. The Bulls are still living with their foot in both worlds. And, while they added more clarity to their roster with going younger, they haven't necessarily added more clarity to their direction in going younger. And that's what this trade deadline could hold for the Bulls. But then again, we have AK and Eversley at the helm, and they could very well look to just keep the same thing going. They very well could look to do that. And, and if that's the case, then that's the case. That's what they look to do. But I also think one of the goals for the remainder of this season, we've talked about development, but one of the key parts of that development is it's time to unleash Matas Buzelis. It's time, y'all. I talked about this kind of more in depth over on Locked On Bulls, but I want to get into it briefly here, right? Matas Buzelis has not only been playing well, he's turned into a plus player in every aspect of the game for the Bulls. He has a point differential when he's on the court of positive 8.7. Teams are scoring 4.5 points less per 100 possessions when Matas is on the court. We're also ourselves scoring 4.2 points more per 100 possessions when Matas Buzelis is on the court. Matas Buzelis right now, as a rookie who still hasn't played a whole lot of minutes but is getting more consistent, has an estimated wins added of 21 wins by his presence and what he's able to do on the court. Now, that's not a perfect stat by any stretch of the imagination, and it could be disproportionate via how much the player has played, but it is time to unleash Matas Buzelis. It just is. It is. We rebound better at 3.2% more when Matas is on the court. Right? That just is. Now, we do have a higher turnover rate when Matas is on the court, but the Bulls overall are a bad turnover team, so I'm not necessarily blaming that just on Matas Buzelis, but that's still something you got to look at. In his 270 minutes played, Matas Buzelis has gone from a player that has been a huge negative for the Chicago Bulls to a huge positive. And he's showing now why at 20 years old that ceiling is extremely high. And then when you get into this, and I know this is going to cause some controversy, I really hesitated bringing this stat to the table because I don't want to cause any arguments in the comment section or people to get triggered, especially because lately the Josh Giddey stands, not fans, the Josh Giddey stands have been very easily triggered people when you say something. They're like, oh my God, but Giddey. It's like nobody's talking about Giddey right now. But when you look at Matas Buzelis, this lineup is slowly turning into the Chicago Bulls' best lineup. Now, again, it's a smaller sample size, but when you look at the fact that Matas Buzelis has played 582 possessions, the most possessions that he's played with is Coby White, Io, Dalen Terry, him, and Jalen Smith. That's the most played lineup that he's played in. Next to that is him playing with Coby White, Io DeSumo, Zach LaVine, Matas Buzelis, and Nikola Vucevic. That's basically replacing Josh Giddey and Patrick Williams in the starting lineup with Ayo Dosunmu and Matas Buzelis, and that lineup has played 33 possessions together, and they're plus 38.4 point differential. They average 160 points per 100 possession. They have a 71.9% effective field goal shooting percentage. That's bananas. And we talk about you have to learn how to manage lineups. That's one thing we all want to see Billy Donovan do. Now, on the flip side of that, when you look at opposing teams, they are averaging 122 points per 100 possessions against that lineup. So again, that lineup is severely missing some defense, even though Matas Buzelis is starting to turn into a solid defender. But I tell you what, that's an interesting lineup. That lineup also, by the way, gets 20% of the total rebounds when they're on the court and 28% of offensive rebounds. It's an interesting lineup to really explore. And I think that what Matas is doing, and he's slowly becoming more part of more and more plus lineups. Another positive plus lineup for Matas Buzelis: Kobe White, THT, Dalen Terry, Buzelis, Jalen Smith. That team is a plus 19.7 point differential and 103 points per 100 possessions, which isn't necessarily great. When you look at that being a bench unit, that's actually good. And they only give that same lineup only gives up 84 points per 100 possessions. So when you look at the goals for the rest of the season, it is about uncovering these lineups for players, I think. And Jalen Smith is another young player that deserves to play more. I talked about that a little bit on yesterday's episode, so I'm not going to get heavily into that as well. But Jalen Smith is another guy who's been a plus player for the Chicago Bulls at plus 3.7 in his minutes out there on the court. And his versatility defensively, even though it's more weak side defense, but he does have an ability to switch and stay with the players for a couple of seconds. That's ended up turning into something big for the team. So one of the goals coming into the season was unlock the young players, develop those young players. And we're seeing via what just the lineups are and things, those young players are developing. Dalen Terry, now, knock on wood with Dalen Terry and his knee injury and things like that, but Dalen Terry is also somebody who's slowly starting to turn into a plus player for the Chicago Bulls. He's not quite there yet, but he's slowly starting to turn into a plus player for the Chicago Bulls, and it's something to watch out for as he gets more comfortable on offense and defense as well. But what we are seeing is that development focus that so many of us talked about coming into the season, it's actually starting to pay off. And we're starting to see some of the results that we want to see from some of those guys. Julian Phillips hasn't necessarily played up to what we saw from him in preseason, and that is what it is. He's dealt with injuries, things like that. I still think he's going to come around. He's not a negative player yet. Teams are scoring 3.7 points worse per 100 possessions when he's on the court, and we're scoring less than 1 point. It's like a half a point better when he's on the court as well. So, there's that aspect of things. So the young players are growing. The young players are developing. And so, and like I said before, having this young core isn't necessarily about saying that they all are going to turn into stars, but it is to say that we can really look at what we have to do with them. And so Matas Buzelis, to get back on it, it's time to unleash Matas Buzelis. It just is. Until he starts showing that he's falling off a cliff, it's time for that. And, while I'm not somebody who says, let's start Matas Buzelis, I'm more so, let's consistently play him over 20 minutes, regardless of wherever he is. Those people those fans that are getting louder and louder in regards to them wanting to see Julian Phillips start, hey, they got more and more credence as he plays more minutes for the Chicago Bulls team and gets more acclimated. So we'll see what happens there. But another player, before we leave, that we're definitely going to be seeing a lot more of is Lonzo Ball. Lonzo Ball has had his minutes restriction now go up. He's going to be able to play 20 minutes consistently for the Chicago Bulls, per what the last thing that we heard, and that is really good. That's really good because, again, much like other players, I know it's a small sample size, but Lonzo Ball has been a huge plus for the Chicago Bulls. When you look at his on-off numbers for Lonzo Ball, the Bulls score 12.8 points more per 100%. I have a 12.8 point differential when he's on the court. We score 14.4 points more per 100 possessions when he's on the court as well. And those two numbers put him in the 90th, 93rd, and 98th percentile respectively. We have an effective field goal shooting percentage of plus 9% when he's on the court. That's the 99th percentile. Our turnover rate is down 3.7% when Lonzo's on the court. That's 97th percentile. What does that mean? Lonzo is having, for an offense that's still trying to find his way, he's having such a plus impact for this team. And I think, and I've talked about this over on Locked On Bulls, go over there to really get my in-depth thoughts there. But When you look at Lonzo Ball, especially when you have young players that are trying to figure their way out, Lonzo Ball could be the best thing for that team to have those minutes for him. And I asked the question, should the Bulls be looking to keep Lonzo Ball maybe long term? Now, I'm going to leave that conversation and let that live over there. So go out there and if you want to have that conversation. But it is something that is legitimate, and it is something that I think needs to be taken notice of. And it's good that his minutes restriction is getting raised, because as we go forth into the rest of the season, you really want to see what Lonzo Ball can continue to do and how he can continue to help this basketball team play basketball. And yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be real fun. But let me know your thoughts on everything down below. Make sure you guys are following the show at Bulls Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns. bullscentralpod@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. That's thanks to you lovely and beautiful people. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See red if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.